the concept of state sovereignty has come to the fore once again in international relations and also in the domestic setting. The ANC-led government has made strong appeals to its own sovereignty in this context as it faces increasing international pressure from various sources. What is sovereignty? Where does the concept come from, and why does it matter so much for us? We're going to unpack that today with Professor Koos Malan, a constitutional jurist and fellow at Sakelige. Professor Koos, I'm delighted to be joined by you today to discuss this topic. We're going to talk about why this matters and why it matters ultimately for Sakelige's mission, and how to think about power relations both domestically in South Africa but also in the international arena. So let's get into this. Perhaps you can elaborate on my introduction. Why has this idea of sovereignty suddenly rushed to the fore again so prominently in just even recent weeks?
Yeah. Russell, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It is important that we actually discuss this precisely because, as you have correctly indicated, it has come to the fore as a practical concept. I mean, at first glance, it looks very theoretical. You can refer to a number of people in philosophy, in political philosophy, back to the 17th century. But leaving that aside for a moment, it is now of great practical importance. The reason why it is of practical importance is because within the South African setting, the African National Congress is actually using the idea of sovereignty as a defense to fend off any possible critique, especially invasive critique that might be leveled against it. The reason why it wants to fend it off is this. The ANC is essentially an anti-constitutionalist institution. And the moment you are anti-constitutionalist, and I'm going to unpack this, the moment you are anti-constitutionalist, you necessarily rely upon the idea of state sovereignty and the sovereignty of the government also. Because sovereignty entitles the claimant of sovereignty to be in a position to do as he or she or it pleases. In contrast to that, the idea of constitutionalism is primarily premised upon the notion of power being vested in a wide variety of centers, and the wide variety of centers being in a relationship towards each other where they exercise checks and balances against each other, so that everyone having a certain amount of power is actually checked and, I should use the word, frustrated by all the others, so as to avoid a situation where any one of them, inclusive of the government, inclusive of the leading party within the government in South Africa, in order to avoid a situation where it is so strong, where it is so competent that it can trample upon the interests of the citizenry generally, or any part of the citizenry, be it the majority or be it a minority. So it is important to focus upon sovereignty, to indicate that when you deal with sovereignty, when you place a very high premium upon that, you're actually engaging in a power strategy in order to place yourself in the strongest possible position to wield as much as possible power without being restrained. That is why sovereignty, state sovereignty and governmental sovereignty are so important.
We've come to associate the word sovereign almost as a synonym, an alternative meaning for the word state or government. So we talk about sovereign wealth funds or sovereign bond markets or sovereign immunity or the sovereign. And when we talk about the sovereign, we often are essentially talking about the state as an entity, or perhaps a king, but vested in statehood. where does what is the core claim of sovereignty? So let's just help people understand what do we mean? What is meant by the concept of sovereignty or the claim of sovereignty? Where does it come from? What is its background, and what ideas have also arisen to oppose the concept? Because the concept seems to almost describe something as a reality rather than perhaps what it may initially have been, which is a normative assertion about power relations. Yeah. So perhaps what is the core claim of sovereignty, and what is the sort of theoretical, intellectual kind of background that sets up this idea?
Yeah, I'll begin with the history, because I think the history actually leads up to a piece of important theory, and it's specifically this theory that is relied upon to claim certain things. We'll say which things just now.
Yeah.
The concept of sovereignty actually goes back to put a specific date upon it, to 1572. That was the date when Jean Bodin's work in France was published. It came against the background of the religious wars, the break that occurred in the Roman Catholic Church in the beginning of the 16th century, which eventually proved to be a break that put the various adversaries in a position where they couldn't reconcile. Before that, the state France, which at that stage was a rising territorial state, used to be a Catholic state. It was part of the definition almost of the state that it was a Catholic state. But after the Reformation, it proved that the Protestants within France were so strong that it was impossible to associate France with a specific religious character, either Protestant or Roman Catholic. That was even though the Protestants were a small minority, but it was a very influential and very powerful minority. The answer to this question of this religious break that happened, which placed people in a position of really engaging in civil war, a protracted civil war. The answer to that was to say, look, we're going to dispel the concept of religion from the public sphere. We're going to put something else in the place of that. And what we're going to put in the place of that is the idea of the state, specifically the government of the state, which in principle doesn't have any specific religious character, but which has only one character, and that is that it is the state, firstly, and that it wields unrestricted power. That's where it comes from. The idea of undivided, unrestricted sovereignty. When I say undivided, unrestricted sovereignty, it's actually a tautology, because sovereignty already suggests, indicates, it denotes that it's total power. There's nothing that can be nothing that could stand in its opposition. So as a result of that, something like religion was dispelled to the private sphere. You could have a private right to a specific religious denomination, private right to specific religious convictions, but the state itself has only this one statist character. That was in France in the 16th century. Shortly after that, well, around about a century after that, you had what? Firstly, the major religious wars still in Europe, specifically the 30 Years' War that raged from 1618 up to 1648, leading up eventually to the peace treaty of Westphalia.
Yeah.
As a result of which the whole idea of a system of sovereign states emerged and was finally established in public international law. So, in other words, public international law was then regarded as a system of a variety of sovereign states, each being capable of doing whatever it pleases to do within its territory.
Before you carry on, and please carry on with that train, but it's fair to say that that system, that international system of sovereign states, is what prevails to this day, with undulations and with threats to that order having occurred over several hundred years. But it sounds to me like you're describing the same system that we're in now.
Absolutely. People would still say, as we're sitting here, that we are within the Westphalian system of sovereign states. Just actually confirming your point, if you look at Article 2, Sub 1 of the Charter of the United Nations, that's precisely what you find there. It is stated there that a fundamental principle of the UN is the principle of the equality of sovereign states.
And that's going to be relevant for later in the conversation, because those concepts are being re-invoked again in the international system as the US starts maneuvering in its own way on the global chessboard, and as the global system potentially moves into a more multipolar order, there's different spheres and different powers, and these claims of sovereignty and of a reassertion of this kind of the sovereignty of states is making a comeback. So it's very relevant. So we're going to come back to that.
Absolutely. So I'm glad that you actually emphasized that. When one says that, when we refer back to 1648, we're referring to actually present day international law, which is being challenged, but still on paper it's there.
Now, this concept of absolute power vested in the state, this concept of sovereignty, for several hundred years, certainly in terms of its kind of theoretical and intellectual tradition. But also there's been a theoretical and intellectual tradition that has opposed that. So maybe you could briefly sketch that out as well.
I just want to say one thing in addition, adding on to what I've said about the position in France with reference to Jean Boudin. In England, from 1642 roundabout up to 1649, there was the English Civil War, which was an extremely tumultuous time in English history. As a matter of fact, the entire 17th century was a century of constitutional struggle in England, the England of the time. Now, the most important theoretical work that was done at that stage was done by Thomas Hobbes. He first, that's now to sum it up in a small nutshell, he first gave a description of what he thought was human nature, but then he also gave a description of what he regarded as the fundamental characteristics of what he regarded as the so-called state of nature, which was viewed against the background of the English Civil War, actually prevalent in his time. He described it as a bellum omnia contra omnes, a war of everybody against everybody, in which life was solitary, nasty, brutish, and short.
The famous Hobbesian quote. Yeah.
Now, then Hobbes provides a solution to summarize it. And the solution was, look, we should overcome these sectarian struggle, and we should overcome it by having a sovereign.
Kind of put an overwhelming force above it all.
Absolutely so.
Something like that, to encompass it all and to manage it all.
And he gave a description to that, namely Leviathan, or the mortal god, which just confirms your point. That was this encompassing and extremely strong sovereign who was interested not so much in the identity of his citizens, more specifically his subjects, but he was interested in only one thing, and that is the so-called formal peace. People must just stay out of the way of each other, and maintain a formal peace. The fundamentals, the fundamental requirement of maintaining the formal peace was a factual thing. It wasn't a theoretical thing. It wasn't a legal thing. This is that the Leviathan, the mortal god, remains in his exceptionally strong position as long as he could not be challenged. So the very first thing that he has to do is to see to it that there is in fact nobody or no institution, nothing that could possibly challenge him.
Yeah.
So everything goes back to unchallenged power, sovereignty. That's what it goes back to. Interestingly, both in terms of the English as well as the French traditions, which are the leading territorial states in the Western world and eventually worldwide, was then based upon this idea of sovereignty, unchallenged sovereignty.
And again, just to anchor this for people, we see then what flows over the subsequent centuries and really gathers real momentum into the late 19th century, and then in a great extreme in the early 20th century is the emergence of what we might call the total state. So the implication, ideas have consequences. This is not just theory. The implication of these types of formulations of what state power is and legitimately should be snowball and give rise to, in certain instances, totalitarian, deeply authoritarian states.
Yeah.
So is it fair to link the concept of sovereignty with kind of unchecked absolutism?
Absolutely so. Because once government is in a position of being unchecked, it can do whatever it pleases to do. In that case, in that situation, it can in fact be authoritarian and it can be totalitarian. Let's unpack this a little bit. In the first instance, it means that there should be unrestrained political power, governmental power, to prescribe to the populace, or then once again to subjects, whatever government, which is the representative, so to say, of the Leviathan, of the sovereign, which is the embodiment of the sovereign, that the populace had to do whatever it prescribed. That's the governmental thing. That is, if one wants to use another word for a moment, is the old Roman idea of imperium, which is in fact, in a sense, the old word for sovereignty. That's the predecessor of the word sovereignty. But at the same time, also prescribe to the citizenry how they should live in their private lives. That's now when you move on to the terrain of real totalitarian power, where the old difference that was recognized between public and private was dispelled, and which made of the private sphere a legitimate sphere for governmental interference and for legislation and so on, even the most private and the most intimate sphere. That's the one thing. So identity, questions of identity. We're not, as government, we're not satisfied with you guys in France being Breton or Provençals or whatever. We want you to be remade in a sense. And adopt a new identity. You have to be remade according to what Leviathan actually wants you to be.
Almost in the image of the state itself.
In the image of the state. Thank you. Actually helped me with that. That's the precise description.
Yes.
In the image of the state. So, in a sense, you have to realize the sinfulness of your nature. And be reborn in the imagery of the state. That's not only a question of theory. That was specifically said by Jean-Jacques Rousseau That was the essence of his political theory.
Okay.
And then a little bit later on, also the idea that government must also have dominion, must also be proprietor. And that's actually the basis of the idea of socialism, okay, which eventually emerged strongest, most prominently
In the 19th century.
in the 19th century and the 20th century still in China, and previously in the Soviet Union and a number of other states, I mean Cuba and so on and so forth. So that's where you have the totalitarian state, where everything that happens everything that occurs within the national territory of a particular state is regarded
It's the prerogative of the state.
It's the prerogative of the state. It's the legitimate terrain of the state. So that's actually very important to realize that. But what is also important is this. What we had in the 17th century and in the 18th century, and perhaps still now, was that the state is primarily interested in retaining the public peace. If the state fails in that regard, it fails. So it's authoritarian in the sense that no power, in the sense of the ability to commit violence, legitimate violence, hopefully, is recognized, safe for the ability to commit violence vesting within the state in the defense force and in the police force. So that's the authority idea. That's the state is in a sense, as far as that is concerned, by definition, authoritarian. But the 17th century state was not necessarily totalitarian. It didn't have anything to do with your identity, with your religion. As I've said,
the totalitarian emergence, seems to be an emergent property over time from
Yes,
these sources.
that's right.
So again, there's a snowballing that happens.
Yeah.
And this authority translates into an ever expanding domain, and then reaching ever deeper into private society and private life.
Yeah, that
Unchecked and building on this legitimacy of sovereignty.
Yeah, absolutely. It's precisely the notion of sovereignty that permits the state to interfere in all spheres. And what is important to indicate is that it is not only in states that are generally defined as totalitarian states where you encounter the totalitarian phenomenon.
Yes.
You also encounter it in a state such as South Africa. I can even say in so-called Western European social democratic states.
Okay, but that point is critical for, I think, leading on to the next section, because from everything you've just said, there's clearly been a backlash against this hyper-centralization of power and this kind of totalitarian state impulse. And where do we find that? We find that in the classical conservative tradition, perhaps in Burkean conservatism. We find that in classical liberal traditions.
Yeah.
Hang on a minute. What's going on here? There's suddenly this very unhealthy concentration of power, this unchecked absolutism. And so you start getting emergent notions of constitutionalism and written constitutions, democracies, parliaments, various mechanisms that start getting put in place to check absolute power, and in a sense to relocate sovereignty. So not to dispense with the idea of sovereignty as such necessarily, but to try and distribute sovereignty in a way, to reallocate it, to relocate it. And that is perhaps what gives rise to what we might think of as something like statist constitutionalism, or the statist constitution, which is a recognition that, hang on, we can't just, it's actually unhealthy to concentrate all this power. So we need to contrive or create or develop mechanisms to distribute this power. And in many respects, that's a healthy impulse. But perhaps there's also deficiencies embedded there, because maybe there's a deficiency in the concept of sovereignty itself. But perhaps you would just like to speak to this idea of how we've tried to reallocate sovereignty to parliaments, or to voters, the people, or perhaps to written constitutions. Perhaps it's a valiant, even noble attempt, but does it really solve the problem?
Yeah. Firstly, yes, most definitely there has been a rise of this whole phenomenon. In practical politics and in practical constitution making, it goes back to the last part of the 18th century, to Enlightenment, and specifically to the two big revolutions, the French Revolution and the American Revolution, and which also eventually gave rise to a certain form of constitutionalism, that is then statist constitutionalism, but with a qualification. In contrast to the idea of sovereignty on behalf of the state vesting in the head of state, vesting in a small number of people.
An executive or a despotic ruler.
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
The idea of Enlightenment was essentially the democratic idea, which goes along with the idea of vox populus, vox Dei. In other words, the voice of God is to be found in the voice of the people. Obviously, in France of that time, it would not have been said, because that was an extremely irreligious thing, but irreligious phenomenon. But the basic idea was, no, if there should be sovereignty, and there should be sovereignty, it should be vesting in the populace, which eventually boils down to the majority. Okay, and that's once again a problem with that form of sovereignty thinking, because what about those who do not form part of the majority?
So you're shifting or trying to allocate the concept of sovereignty somewhere else.
That's it.
But you don't necessarily free yourself from the totalizing impulses of the concept, because you're just now putting it into the mob, into the majority, or into maybe even the courts, who might then make despotic judgments, or lord it over the system with judgments, and then you're just vesting power once again into a small group.
That's right. Well, that was essentially a phenomenon, the whole idea of let's call it the sovereignty of the courts, or at least vesting a certain amount of power in the judiciary, so as to control a majority.
Yeah.
That is, or to control the executive. That is something that goes back, interestingly, not to the United States in the first place. Yes, it became very important there from 1803 with the case of Marbury versus Madison. But actually that idea goes back to England of the beginning of the 17th century with so-called Bonham's case. I didn't specifically prepare on that, so I'm very glad that I actually remember it. Of the idea of the courts playing a more and more important role. And obviously the courts play a very important role in the United States. But let's take one step back. In order to elevate the courts into a position where they play a very important role and could possibly even claim to be sovereign, you have to have something else. You have to have a written constitution. And you have to say, well, look, instead of the people being sovereign, instead of an executive or the king or whoever being sovereign, sovereignty, the final last say, vests in the written constitution. But there's a problem with the written constitution. Constitution have this streak not to be able to speak for themselves.
Yes.
They speak only through somebody.
Yes.
People.
Interpretation. And some authority that gives effect to the words that are written.
It.
Yes.
That is why it can convincingly be argued that the trite constitutional theory says there's trias politica, separation of powers between the legislature, the executive, and the courts. And there's actually something else. There's something like interpretive power. Who has interpretation power to attach a binding interpretation to a document? Now, let's not go into that now in detail. What I can say is this, that eventually, and South Africa can be used as a good example, and we have discussed it on a previous occasion, and referring to myself, I paid a tremendous amount of attention to that. Eventually, the institutions, the bodies that have interpretation power to tell you what the Constitution says, are perfectly in step with the dominating powers within a particular state. For example, the South African Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal would, for example, now and then go against the fundamental policy of the African National Congress. But whenever it comes to crucial ideological questions, they will always speak in the same language, or always at least come to the same conclusion as the ruling party. There's no question about that. We can go into detail. So in other words, into details in that. So in other words, that doesn't solve your problem as to sovereignty.
Can I just consolidate this information?
Sure.
So South Africa is another country that claims to have a sovereign constitution. We have what we might call constitutional supremacy as opposed to parliamentary sovereignty or parliamentary supremacy or whatever, whatever it might be. And yet, and so there's a claim that the Constitution is supreme. And yet, as you've just pointed out, constitutions don't speak for themselves. They can't get up and walk and exercise real action. They're simply documents that are given effect to, interpreted by, and have different aspects emphasized by judges, political executives, parliamentarians, administrators, and ultimately voters who see the constitutional framework in all sorts of different and subjective ways, because they read different parts differently and they understand the words to mean different things, and they emphasize the aspects that they like the most more than the aspects that they like the least. And so the Constitution ends up not being this supreme so much as it becomes an area of contestation, and power actually will vest where it has always vested, which is in real institutions run by real people with real resources.
Yeah.
And that's the essence of this.
That's the essence.
Yeah.
But it's also a crucial part of the essence for purposes of our discussion, is that everything that we have just said in relation to sovereignty can be defined as a form of statist sovereignty. All this takes place, all these debates, the entire discourse takes place within the boundary of statist constitutionalism, as if only institutions, bodies that are somehow related to the state, that are somehow organs of state, or if not defined like that, at least aspects of the state. It's the error actually to associate constitutionalism only with the state in all its various forms.
This is a critical point. So
I think it is. Yeah.
Let's now lean into that point, that this idea of constitutionalism and what is the Constitution needs to be thought of and is productively thought of as something beyond the state.
Yeah.
So I did cut you off. You were on a roll there, but I just wanted to again just consolidate there. Right. Let's push into that.
Now, interestingly, the alternative to this also goes back around about 4 centuries. Also to a person, namely Johannes Althusius, who wrote on this, a Dutchman, who wrote on this in the year 1603. um, in Politica. That was his main work. Now, in Politica, he basically argued for an alternative form of constitutionalism, in which he would, for example, in which he did say the following. He would say, look, the fundamentals of any constitutional order, not that the words constitutional order were specifically used, but the fundamentals are, in the first place, the family, which to him was a private institution, a private body, and that private body had to be protected. Not only individuals, but specifically the family. Okay? The family also had an important economic implication, because it's within the family that people could eventually seek and get economic protection. People were maintained economically and otherwise within the family.
Yeah.
So for that reason, it was important to give protection to the family. That was the first fundamental institution. Then secondly, what he called the so-called collegia, that's companies. That is the economic sphere. That's trade and industry. And once again, it was important to Althusius that the integrity of that sphere should be recognized, at least to the extent that interference into the operation of collegia, just like the family, should not be tolerated.
So it's starting to set up spheres of authority, or domains of legitimate authority and action.
That's right. From below.
From the ground up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, against the background of the situation that was prevalent at that stage, he placed a considerable amount of importance, attaches considerable amount of importance to the city, okay? Which, to his mind, was the most important institution, body within the public sphere then, which we would nowadays regard as the public sphere, or then the constitutional sphere. But the other two were already also in the constitutional sphere.
Yes.
In other words, they were bodies and spheres within the constitutional sphere, but outside the state, which boils down to saying that the constitutional idea is not limited to the state,
Yes.
as would have been argued by Boudin or by Hobbes and everybody afterwards. No, it actually begins with these private and civic institutions.
That actually gives life to constitutionalism.
That's it. That's it.
That's the
gives
nucleus.
life to, and it also secures freedom, economic freedom, private forms of freedom, and so on and so forth, within the family sphere, within the economic sphere, and so on and so forth, which does not mean that you have unrestrained authority within any of those spheres.
Yes.
Because they had authority only relating to the subject matters attaching to those spheres, and not more than that.
And this is perhaps again so some people who recognize the importance of decentralized power and authorities will sometimes talk about sphere sovereignty.
Yeah.
So sovereignty within the family sphere, within the church sphere, within the business sphere. But
that's it.
But even then, it's not sovereignty, is it? Because you're not unchecked. You can't just do as you
it's please. It's a misnomer.
In any of those spheres. So all the spheres have a limited degree of authority, subject to the checks and balances of all the other spheres.
Of all the others. Now, then after the city, in which political authority vests in the first place, according to Althusius, you had the provinces, and then eventually the empire of that, the Western European empire of the time. Okay. Building upon that, one should ask the question, what should be the appropriate view that we should pursue regarding constitutionalism. Can we say something about that?
Absolutely, yes.
The important thing is this, that each and every one of us, as we sit here and as people are listening to us, regardless of the sphere in which we might be, a professional person, someone in education, a minister of religion, and so on and so forth, is actually within a constitutional order, but not only as an audience to the constitutional order, not only as an onlooker, but as an active participant. Now, let me just, I'm going to say more about this just now, but just the following important thing is this. I said that just briefly at the beginning, that the African National Congress, like all totalitarian institutions. Now, the ANC is a fairly big failure, and it's not only derogatory to say so. I think we can describe that. We have this whole fracas at the moment surrounding the dispute between the president and the army and the police and so on.
There's a fair bit of factual evidence to back up your claim.
It's a fair bit of factual evidence. Absolutely so. You don't engage in defamation or in libel if you say so.
Yeah.
So, but what the ANC has within the chaos that it causes, it still has very strong totalitarian aspirations. One should not forget that. That is precisely for that reason that in each and every policy document, leading policy document, for example, its so-called strategy and tactics documents, over the last 30, 40 years, the ANC would always say, we want to have control over so-called all levers of power. And then it says the legislature, the executive, the courts, it includes the courts, the army, the police, and then it goes on and say the civic sector, the economic sector, and so on and so forth. And they introduce and institute policies in order to give effect to that.
Yes.
BE, affirmative action, and so on. Which
and forms of nationalization and state control over resources.
That's it. Yeah. In other words, what we referred to 20 minutes ago, that it doesn't only want to be government, but it also wants to be owner, proprietor. Yeah. It also wants to be the institution determining your identity, your private identity. It wants to do all that. It says it explicitly in its policy documents. Now, if we correctly state that constitutionalism implies, by definition, that you have a variety of centers of power, authority, and influence, and that they have to be in a situation of mutual checks and balances, mutual frustration, one can almost say. If that is the basis, if that's the core of the constitutional idea, then it means that the ANC policy, as it has been stated repeatedly, is fundamentally at loggerheads with the idea of constitutionalism. It is not unconstitutional, it's anti-constitutional. That's what you have. Now, what should be the answer to that? Well, the answer to that should be to say, look, there might be a government, but the government has its appropriate place. It should be government and only government, but then also government within the network of institutions within the state. All right, legislature, executive, a variety of legislatures and executives, because you might have a quasi-federal system as in South Africa, or a federal system in the United States or Germany or Nigeria, and so on. So you have power being dispersed amongst a large number of centers of power, exercising checks and balances over one another, as a result of which no one is really sovereign. Everyone is kept in check, but that's not where it stopped. In medieval times, and yes, strangely enough, it might be we might refer to medieval times. the church was a crucially important, played a crucially important part in the constitutional order broadly defined. Professor Harold Berman of Emory University is someone that I really regarded as a primary thinker in the field of constitutional law, said that the fundamental separation of church and worldly powers, not state, because there wasn't a state in medieval times, but that fundamental separation that was given effect to back in the year 1075, he regarded that as a constitutional moment of the first order. And I actually agree with him. As a result of which the church always, through the entire medieval period, had a very important constitutional role to play. And it did play that role, but that's not, very often it didn't. Very often it failed in that regard. But at least in principle, that was the mode of thinking. Right.
Yes.
But then apart from that, a vast number of other institutions in present-day South Africa, in present-day Europe, the United States or wherever. What about the economic sphere, trade and industry? You have a large number of people, learned people, competent people, who are much better positioned than the Department of Trade and Industry, for example, to tell what must happen within the economic sphere. So they should, the economic sphere, trade and industry, should have their own autonomous, and I like to use the word autonomous, because autonomy falls way short of sovereignty. But it does recognize the idea that there is authority vesting in them.
Yes.
Let them be in a position to be in self-control, not to do whatever they want to do, because they also have a relationship with employees, with the state, and so on and so forth.
Let me jump in here, because this is very relevant, of course, to Sakeliga and to our role as an independent business community and business organization that attempts to assert authority over the economic sphere at some level. And what you said a word there, you said the word let them do that. But the state is not going to let them do that. The state is not of a mind to concede some of these spheres. And therefore there's an inevitable sense in which some authority, perhaps all authority at some level, has to be claimed, has to be asserted. Someone has to step into that void. Someone has to step into that vacuum, if there is a vacuum, or press that advantage. Perhaps just your thoughts on that, because there's often this idea that, well, if the state lets us do X, then we can do X, or the government should let this and that happen. But to the extent that they're not going to do that, to the extent that they want dominion, that they want full sovereign claim over all spheres, you now at some level come into a place of conflict. And you could argue that to a large degree the litigation efforts that we undertake are forms of negotiated, mediated conflict. They are conflict resolution, if you like, or dispute resolution mechanisms. But they sort of prefigure potentially broader antagonisms between these spheres, because the implication you can't get away from here, Koos, is contestation for some of these spheres.
I fully agree with that. The point is that if one argues that the state must permit or allow you to do it, you make a fundamental error. The fundamental error is that your assumption is that of statist constitutionalism. But the moment your assumption is something entirely different, something different in principle, namely that constitutional is a broad societal constitutionalism. In a previous article about 2 months ago, I specifically used those words. And I think it's very important to refer to that, a societal constitutionalism, where in which trade and industry actually played a very important role. So if the state intervenes and denies the authority to trade and industry to exercise a considerable amount of control over that particular sphere, the state is actually acting outside its place. It's an abuse of power. It's an anti-constitutional way of thinking and acting. So,
but it then needs to be counter-opposed.
It must be absolutely so. So the whole idea, and you mentioned the word assert,
yes,
that is very important. And one must assert it from a point of view of being legitimately doing so. Because in a sense, that is from a constitutional point of view, from a constitutionalism point of view, what trade and industry should do. That is, in a sense, their constitutional responsibility, not by virtue of this or that provision in the South African Constitution, but by virtue of the fundamental core idea of constitutionalism, where you have to take up your, that is your station, that is your position, that is your place, and you should discharge the responsibilities, play the role that is accompanied by that particular position.
Now this takes us, and I'd like to end our conversation with this takes us to this crossroads, because you spoke about how the state would illegitimately infringe upon spheres, but nonetheless it may do so. It may be successful in doing so if it is not actually countered. And what happens is that a lot of people, and indeed we use these mechanisms domestically, will then appeal to what we might think of as jurispolitik, or the law.
Yeah.
And we will say you are illegitimately infringing. And where there is very clear provision for that, and where it can be shown very clearly, and where compelling arguments can be brought before fair and responsible courts, that kind of argumentation can be effective. But there are some areas of encroachment that where there's not provided for in written law necessarily.
Yeah.
It becomes a matter of not so much appealing to the morality or the legitimacy, so-called, in a theoretical sense of whether someone encroaches too far or not, but simply whether they can do it, whether they have the power to do it. And I'd like to take that juxtaposition and just bring that in the final analysis to the international system. Because what we see is we see global actors, whether it's large powers, regional powers like Russia or China, whether it's a global power like America or other smaller regional powers, acting, and then people responding to that by saying you've broken international law or you've done so illegitimately. But really what's going on is the assertion of power politics and interest-based politics. And there's lots of complaints about that from a sort of juristic perspective, but what's really going on is a clash of real interests and the mediation of power relations. And I want you to just maybe speak to that and explain that what's going on globally, because we've seen this very recently, for example, with the Trump administration's actions in Venezuela, and then howling about the breaking of international law. But you hear howling in the media for a few days about the breaking of international law, and then nothing happens and life goes on, because power has asserted itself. And it seems to me the only way to then counter that would be a counter-assertion of power. And in the final analysis, that seems to be what domestic societal constitutionalism ultimately also boils down to, is the ability to defend spheres of authority in reality, rather
Yeah.
than by appealing necessarily only to law or to kind of juridical concepts,
Or to government as if they have the final say.
to then grant you
May I
that.
just say before before tackling your question specifically, apart from trade and industry having this constitutional responsibility, this also applies to educational institutions. Universities and technical colleges and so on should, for example, not be subdivisions of the state. Education generally shouldn't be subdivisions of the state. The state, in a sense, has nothing to do with that.
Yeah, but they are.
Yes, that's right. Why? Because they have encroached, because they have been allowed to do that.
Yes.
That's the reason. At the same time, the church has a long tradition of being outside the narrowed statist constitutionalism. The state should the church should take up their role and play their role as far as that is concerned. That's very important.
And if I may, I think why this latches on to my question as
Yeah.
well is, in the case of universities, for example, let's say, it would be virtually impossible for a university to use the mechanism of litigation
Yeah.
to extract the state away from it or out of it. It's already conceded to that. It's already accepted that.
It has been normalized.
It's been normalized, and so that is now embedded in legal norms. So it's not that litigational mechanisms are not productive or can't be productive. It's that there's certain instances where they're no longer appropriate.
Yeah.
And in an instance like that, the question would be, could those universities actually regain true independence again? And I think the answer is yes, over time, with concerted effort at asserting independence,
Yeah.
but almost certainly not through some sort of court case.
No. I think it begins with curriculum. That's actually where it begins.
In that instance, yes,
Yeah.
but it's a process of real assertion of independence.
Absolutely. The bottom line, as far as this is concerned, the question is concerned domestically, is that law, and as we'll see just now, all law is actually contested terrain. Law hasn't simply dropped down from the heavens. No, law is fought for. It is inherently embattled.
Yeah.
The way in which law establishes itself, the way in which law came about, is as a result of a particular struggle that was won. The way in which law changes is precisely also as a result of a successful battle. So the point is that making law takes one into the political sphere to engage in successful and intelligent battle in order to make better and new law. Now that takes us to the international law field. And we said, well, you said 20 minutes ago we would come to this point. Here we are now.
Yeah.
Here you have the Charter of the United Nations speaking about the importance of borders to be retained, specifically the way they are. We have a lot of international legal rules saying you must protect the integrity of the so-called national integrity, the territorial integrity, and so on. States are inherently...
The fact that those borders have not always been like that is sort of glossed over.
That's just simply forgotten about.
The borders became like that through the real power relations, but now these are the borders that we're serious about. These are the ones that must be protected.
That's it. Now let me just briefly say, it's a little bit of history once again. There's a wonderful book that was published 30 years back by Ernst Greve, Epochs of International Law. It was a German book. It was translated into English. And in some international law textbooks, that book is referred to. Now, Greve said, well, if you look at the history of public international law over the past 550 years, you find that initially there was the so-called Spanish Age or Spanish Epoch. Why was it a Spanish Epoch? Why did the Pope divide the world between the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire? Well, simply because they were the strongest empires. There was no opposition. So that ushered in the Spanish era, the Spanish epoch in international law. So power was the cradle for the law that was created,
Power defines international
Exactly.
law, not the other way around.
not the other way around. Then followed, and to my mind, I think it's a little bit challengeable actually. Then, according to Greve, followed the French epoch, followed then eventually by the English epoch. Okay, we know about that. I mean, the English invaded the Boer republics. It was essentially a completely illegitimate war.
Yeah.
But they won the war. The Boer republics were not capable of eventually fending off the British. But that was the epoch, the English epoch. They did whatever eventually they pleased to do. Okay, so they, at some stage, they changed the law 150 years before that, once again as a result of changed power relations. Spain was no factor anymore. France was much less of a factor. England actually was victorious over France in the Seventh Year War, 1756 to 1763, and thereafter the English epoch. Okay, and then further epochs. All right. What is happening at the moment is that there was a kind of an epoch from the Second World War up to 1989, 1990, with the collapse of the Soviet Empire.
Yeah.
Thereafter, you had a short epoch, which many people were extremely hilarious about, very happy about that. Now it's a wonderful new epoch of multilateralism. That is actually not so. While that was happening, the great powers still in the Security Council of the United Nations clashed, and they exercised the veto power in order to give effect to their own relations.
Their own interests.
The only thing was at that stage, China was not that strong. America was, in a sense, weak, even though in principle they were strong, but they didn't use their power. Russia was cut down to size, small size. Russia is now a little bit stronger again. China has become very strong. And America, under the new administration, is now extremely assertive. Okay? So what do you have? Just like the transition from the French to the English epoch in public international law, we're witnessing the beginning of a new epoch in which the United States says, one, there is a Western Hemisphere. It includes Greenland, and we're going to assert ourselves in these areas. We are in a situation of contestation in the Polish northern pole sphere with Russia and China, and we're not going to allow them to assert themselves here. We're strong enough, we're going to do it. And we're going to assert power. I don't want to use the word sovereignty, but we're going to assert sufficient power over Greenland precisely in order to do that.
Yeah.
But what about two things that you have in international law, in the Charter? What about the equality of states? It's a fiction. And a fiction simply can't stand against power. Power is simply strong. Power is not going to be hindered. The power of a great power in the United States, like the United States, in immediate vicinity, is not going to be controlled by the idea of the equality of states. So we do whatever it pleases there. But it can't do whatever it pleased in the South China Sea, because there it clashes against
another great
China.
power.
Yeah, another great power.
Yeah.
So I think we're moving into a new epoch in public international law, where the old rules are clearly being regarded for what they are. Many of the old rules, not all of them, but the two that I've just mentioned, equality of states, so on, with that is clearly, it clearly comes to the fore that they are actually nothing more than symbolism, nothing more than fictions, and those fictions are just going to be swept aside by power. That's what it boils down to.
Seems to me there's an interesting, as we bring this to a close, there's an interesting intersection here between what's going on in international politics and then how we think about constitutionalism domestically. The ANC-led government wants to think that South Africa, being a sovereign, independent state, speaks with one voice in relation to international relations. And what we're seeing is increasing willingness on behalf of other foreign states and on behalf of domestic organizations and institutions to regard multiple voices and multiple spheres of influence from within South Africa. So in the engagements between the United States and the ANC-led government in South Africa, there's been a lot of pressure being brought to bear, a lot of criticism being levied on the South African government, and the counterclaim is we're a sovereign independent state. We speak with only one voice, and it's our voice. And the Americans, but also other countries increasingly are essentially starting to disregard that and to say, no, we will speak with whoever we want to there, and we will establish good relations with whoever is willing to counter-establish good relations, and we will work in our best interests with whoever is willing to cooperate with us in that way, in mutual benefit. And so this is kind of this idea of decentralized diplomacy, even that state-to-state diplomacy in this changing order is potentially dissolving to at least some degree and giving way to state to non-state and perhaps non-state to non-state forms of diplomacy. And I think that's something that people need to really watch and kind of monitor as a trend.
I think that is very important, and it's specifically relevant in relation to South Africa, because here you have the dwindling ability of the South African government to effectively engage in international relations. They simply can't. In contrast to a variety of well-organized institutions within the civic sphere, within the economic sphere, who can actually do it, and who do have the necessary people with the necessary know-how to actually do it. It seems to me that institutions such as Sakeliga, such as the Free Market Foundation, such as AfriForum, and many others are much better positioned, and a lot of individuals attached to these institutions are much better positioned to negotiate to the benefit of certain portions of the South African populace, but also to the benefit of the populace in general. Much better negotiate and achieve and promote the interests of the entire populace than the South African government is capable of doing.
It's really interesting. So on a final note, we just want to consolidate this idea of constitutional sovereignty, the claim of constitutional supremacy or sovereignty, versus something like a genuine societal constitutional order, which is recognizing the importance in a Sakeliga context of business and civil society, the business community, business organizations, organized business, but also just independent businesses that build and create order in society. Critically important vector of constitutionalism. And I think you've helped us really cement that and think much more clearly about that, that the concept of sovereignty really means something like absolute power, and what we believe is so healthy for the good of society is decentralized power, not just within state structures, but the key insight is that goes beyond state structures to all structures of society, to all meaningful structures of society, and therefore that those different spheres and different structures should cultivate legitimately the ability to develop strength and authority and means through personnel, capital, equipment, and various other means to in fact assert the authority, healthy legitimate authority in their
Yeah.
spheres.
Yeah.
And that begins to eat away at Leviathan, at the concept of the central sovereign that can be absolute,
Yeah.
and that can be absolved in
Yes.
all its actions, and
Yes.
that can act unchecked. That is what is so for me, it resonates so strongly in this. So Professor, do you want to have a final comment, and then I'll close
Yeah,
off?
perhaps just one or two comments. In the first place, this Leviathan is not going to live forever. This is what Hobbes specifically also said. It's a mortal god. We should keep that in mind. This implies that you need not be in the receiving end of the illegitimate exercise of power and so-called authority by this Leviathan. It need not be the case. It must not be the case. The important change to make is a change in the mind. Whenever it acts outside its powers, it acts illegitimately, it may not do so, and there must be pushback. Then an important concept, I've used the concept in the past 2 years, you know that, we spoke about that on a number of occasions, the idea of means of government. The means of government, of this government is diminishing.
The tools and the
tools. Thank you.
the
That's the
ability.
word I've used. Tools. Thank you for reminding me. The tools of government. It has diminished tools of government. We can go into much detail about that. Also, even tools of government relating to the most essential forms of power, namely police power, defense power, military power, and so on. I don't even speak about the ability to sustain infrastructure. It has simply lost a tremendous amount of those tools of government. Those tools of government actually vest increasingly in the civic sphere, within the economic sphere. The important thing is to know, is to realize that taking up those tools of government and exercising them to the benefit of the populace in general is actually engaging in the most sound constitutional practice that you could think of. This is precisely what we've already started to do in the private sector, in the economic sphere, in civil society, and in times to come, with a government that is diminishing, with a government that is getting weaker, we will do much more of that, and we have to do it knowing that we are doing a legitimate thing to the benefit of everybody.
Professor Koos Malan from the Free Market Foundation, headquarters here at the lovely Northwoods House in Johannesburg. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.